In the distant corners of the Outer Rim, Hutt justice was all that kept the warring tribes of subsistent farmers from tearing entire planets apart. The rule of the Nal Hutta clans and their Khajidic philosophy ensured that at the very least, killers and thugs from lesser syndicates could never terrify tribute-paying civilians. And if the bloodthirsty criminals did, then they would have to face Hutt justice. On the sand-swept dunes of Tatooine, that meant one thing: a quick trip to the Sarlacc pit, the most powerful Hutt of the world. The massive, green mucus-covered slug known as Jabba favored executing his enemies by slowly pushing them off the side of a wooden plank and watching them plummet into the waiting beak of the monstrous Sarlacc in the great pit of Krrsantan. But that Sarlacc wasn't always such a monstrous being. In fact, before he devoured the Beskar armor-wearing bounty hunter, Boba Fett, the Sarlacc of Krrsantan was an innocent little baby sailing on the blistering winds of Tatooine's midday sun. So, how exactly did the terrifying Sarlacc's life begin, and how did he become Jabba's favorite executioner? That's today's underrated moment. The coarse wooden plank wasn't an altogether unfamiliar feeling for Grubbart Filch, as his bandaged feet slid backwards one step at a time. He couldn't help but remember all the times he and his family visited the local playgrounds on Mos Espa. The trips weren't often, especially during the pod racing season, when Grubbart was off placing bets with his wife's weekly grocery budget. But they weren't frequent enough for his family of over 24 children to remember. In fact, those trips were among the few memories they could recall in later decades when New Republic historians would visit Filch's descendants in search of small anecdotes about Jabba the Hutt. "Curse you, Jabba!" Grubbart roared, balling his two handcuffed paws into fists. The rotten stench of the Sarlacc and the hundreds of poor souls it slowly digested wasn't so bad at night. But in the midday sun, when the winds roared upwards, the smell wasted no time wafting up. Grubbart was stuck between a rock and a hard place. On one side, a pair of Weequay guards pushed and prodded at him with a pair of serrated durasteel spears, and Jabba, the slimy slug crime lord, watched from behind. "Curse you and all your money-grubbing, blood-sucking brothers!" Grubbart shouted again, managing to sound even more desperate than before. There were only a few inches left on the plank before he would have nowhere left to go, and would have to face the plunge into razor-sharp teeth and bone-crunching tendrils of the Sarlacc. Before the Weequays could stretch their hands further and jab Grubbart closer to the edge, the long-eared Lepi let out another last-minute rant. "But above and beyond all curses on the Hutts! Curse you, Boba Fett! Damn you for tracking me to my warren and family and dragging me to Hutt justice!" It was true. Boba Fett, the famed Mandalorian bounty hunter, had managed to track Grubbart down. Beneath his green and red Beskar helmet, Boba was more than just an unmodified clone of Jango Fett. He was a guildsman and a strict advocate of the bounty hunting code. That meant Fett was expected to carry a certain amount of professionalism with him at all times, and he wouldn't let a small matter, like the fact that Grubbart would be leaving behind a family of 20 young, starving lepus, distract him from collecting on a bounty. As Jabba looked on, his crusted mouth curled open and tried to assuage the man he was murdering that it wasn't Boba's fault, and was not certainly the Hutt's, but actually Grubbart's. And that, too, was true. Grubbart had stolen funds from Jabba and, hoping to strike it rich, placed it all on a pod race that he swore was going to win. But like so many other times, Grubbart lost, and this was the last time Jabba would tolerate it. Before Grubbart had a chance to argue against Jabba's final point, 4 ringed tendrils leapt out of the desert floor. The Sarlacc, just like the rest of the crew on Jabba's board, had heard enough. It was time to eat. As Lepi was torn into pieces, the crew aboard the barge was satisfied that the job was complete. With a dismissive wave of his hand, Jabba ordered his Gamorrean guards to turn the ship back towards his palace, halfway around the desert, and they soon departed for a night of revelry and music, thanks to the Max Rebo Band. Over the next 12 hours, as the dual suns of Tatooine fell behind distant plateaus, and the largest of its 3 moons, Gamorresan, rose, the Sarlacc burped clouds of gas into the air. Digesting Grubbart had released something within, and by the next day, the Sarlacc used the extra energy to birth a child. Opening its massive mouth, the beak of the Sarlacc spit an arrow-shaped spore into the midday winds and sent it soaring over the dunes. Little more than an infant, the tiny Sarlacc was piloted by its instincts, as in searching for a host it used its yet-to-be-formed tendrils to push and pull on a thin pink membrane which helped it catch the desert winds. As it propelled itself past a herd of wild banthas, it quickly spotted a patrol of desert stormtroopers riding a trio of hardy dewbacks, the perfect creature for a baby Sarlacc to feast on. Faster than an arrow, the spore dove down and attached to the lead dewback's shoulder. It plunged its tiny beak between the dewback's thick green scales and gorged itself on its blood. By the time the sand trooper navigated to a small Jawa encampment, the Sarlacc had grown to 3 times its size. "See to my dewbacks," the lead sand trooper ordered a pair of brown-cloaked Jawas as he threw a handful of golden Imperial credits to the scavengers. "Feed and clean her, and you'll get this much again in the morning." By this point, the Sarlacc's appetite was growing, and the dewback's shoulder was bleeding profusely, leaking a stream of red blood into the sand. As the Jawas got to work, they threw the dewbacks into a small puddle, a rare sight to see on a world where moisture needed to be collected on farms. They quickly grabbed the baby Sarlacc, and with a few yanks, managed to rip its razor-sharp beak from the dewback's thinning limb, but not before the massive beast let out a cry of pain. The sight of a Sarlacc spore must have been nothing special for the Jawas, as they quickly threw the blob of red and green mush into the pool of water. Not long after, another Jawa came up to the banks of the pond and used a transparent glass bucket to scoop up a vat of water. He couldn't help but notice the Sarlacc blob bobbing up and down in his jar, but the Jawa quickly decided to think nothing of it. He needed to clean an off-brand astromech droid, and he couldn't bother himself with figuring out whatever the organic mess was. But it would make a good rag to clean droids. The Jawa grabbed the sponge-like Sarlacc in one hand and mashed its body into the sharp rivets and panels of the astromech, using friction to erode the black stains on its chassis. The force of the job didn't seem to faze the Sarlacc at all, and when a flock of blood-sucking sketos descended and poked at the Sarlacc spore, the infant took the opportunity to escape. Thanks to the dewback blood, the day-old creature's tendrils were more developed and more powerful. In a single leap, it attached itself to the neck of the sketo and began to suck the beast dry. The bird tried to escape. With no hands to pry the Sarlacc off its body, it hoped that if it flew long enough, the parasite on its chest would fall away. But it was a poorly thought-out plan. In less than a day, the Sarlacc devoured every last drop of sketo blood, growing to the size of a bantha. When the bird finally dropped dead, the Sarlacc slithered through the desert on its own. After summiting a small ridge of sandy mountains, it encountered a towering 3-headed sand spider. In almost no time at all, the arachnid unleashed its 3 massive jaws on the adolescent Sarlacc, tearing apart its red and green limbs bite by bite. By the end of the day, all that remained of the creature was a red patch of sand where its blood stained the desert. As soon as the meal was finished, the massive armored spider turned its 8 lumbering legs away from the mountains and toward a line of sharp-peaked dunes. With a taste of Sarlacc fresh on its tongue, the beast used its enhanced sense of smell to look for another one, and the small fragments of rotting body parts that the spider's olfactory detected pointed southwest towards Jabba's palace. At over 10 tons, it wasn't easy for a spider to walk up and down the mountains of sand. After all, its body was designed to hide in the caves of Tatooine's canyons and survive by catching lost banthas in its web whenever it was fortunate enough to catch one. A trek across the desert could be deadly, but the taste of Sarlacc was worth it. When the twin suns of Tatooine once again waned and the day had ended, the spider used its limbs to push aside sand on the surface of a dune and build itself a small nest. From the end of its long armored tail, a line of webbing shot out, and the monster used it to coat itself in a makeshift blanket for the night. But the next morning it was dead. Even though the spider had torn the Sarlacc apart piece by piece, it had reassembled itself within the spider's stomach and used its new body to pierce through the spider's back. In an explosion of red blood and brown body parts, the Sarlacc exploded out, revealing its final form, a massive serpent of tendrils and spikes topped with a powerful maw on its head. Sensing a distant sandstorm was growing closer and closer, the now adult Sarlacc crawled into a crevice to hide from the savage sand, which could strip the durasteel plates from a land speeder. The days seemed to pass all at once as the Sarlacc waited patiently in its new home for its next meal. But it wouldn't have to wait long. Soon, Boba Fett and Jabba the Hutt would visit the monster in order to feed it their latest captive, Han Solo. But the execution wouldn't go as planned. Instead of the Corellian smuggler, the Sarlacc would feast on the Mandalorian Boba Fett. It seemed, in the end, that Grubbart's curse came true.